Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Ali, CEO and co-founder of Node. Today's guest is Mr. Florian Budde, a highly respected leader in the global chemicals industry. Florian spent nearly 30 years at McKinsey, where he helped establish and lead the firm's global chemicals and ag practice. He advised CEOs around the world on major transformations operationally and strategically. He also led McKinsey's Global Industry Solutions, which is data and technology-driven consulting activities, as part of McKinsey's new venture team. He holds advanced degrees in physical chemistry and is the author of the well-known book Value Creation Strategies for the Chemical Industry. Since retiring from McKinsey 4 years ago, he has continued to stay active and currently advises companies across the chemical and tech space. Mr. Florian Budde, great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. Any
Hi,
questions about your background?
perfect.
Perfect. Okay, great. It's great to see you again. Florian, you've seen a lot in this industry. You've had a front row seat. You've been in many boardrooms. You've witnessed the industry evolve across multiple cycles. First question, what are the biggest structural shifts you've seen, and which ones have surprised you the most?
The industry, or winning in the industry, is all about being in a field with high industry utilization and having a good position on the industry cost curve. And what has most influenced the industries were shifts in the industry utilization, i.e., the balance between demand and supply. The first one that I really witnessed was a major downturn of the industry in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s of the last century, when massive capacities were built up in the Middle East, in particular in petrochemicals, resulting in, let me say, a very weak economic situation for companies in Western Europe and North America. It was actually the first time when an industry cycle occurred. Until then, the development had been very steady, and what we know as the typical cyclicality of the chemical industry did not exist. Now, that situation was remedied when around 95, again, a major shift in the global demand and supply balance occurred when China entered the scene, starting to be a huge demand sink for chemical products from Europe and from the US. And that demand sink was active until 2015, around 2015, maybe a little later, when essentially, when that demand sink stopped to be a demand sink and became actually a supply source, i.e., when China not only became self-sufficient in supplying its needs with its own chemical factories, but also when China started to export surplus capacity into Europe and into the US. And that is when the current downturn of the chemical industry started.
First off, I always enjoy having these conversations with you because you are a historian of this industry. And no matter how much I read, it gives me confidence when I hear you speak about it, because then I know what I've read is actually accurate or not. How would you describe today's environment, especially in Europe?
Let me again start with a general comment. The chemical industry is not really a global industry. It is a multi-regional industry, which means the regions are connected, but have somewhat, but only somewhat different dynamics. On a global scale, what we do have is very poor demand and supply balance, very poor industry utilization. But that very poor industry utilization is not distributed evenly over the planet. It is particularly bad in Europe. The latest numbers that I have heard are somewhere between 70 and 75%, which is clearly way below the lifeline, which is starting maybe at 80, 85%. And the reason for that is that Europe has very high energy prices and it has a ton of regulation that's not really favorable for the industry. And that results in the fact that, let me say, the oversupply gets distributed unevenly, and Europe unfortunately gets a lot of it, which means a lot of Chinese products that does not find customers in China gets exported to Europe, and sometimes in very aggressive ways. There's plenty of cases where Chinese exporters export at prices which are below variable cost. We don't really understand why that happens, because usually that doesn't happen. But occasionally it's happening now. And a lot of that material goes to Europe, which makes the situation in Europe particularly difficult.
The demand in China, as you stated, has softened. Production continues. That material needs to go somewhere. Based on what you said, it appears that the majority of it's ending up in Europe. And when you combine that with high energy costs, high regulatory costs, like you've said, and I'll add one thing to it, which is an inability to shift labor costs like we can in other parts of the world quickly. How does Europe come out of this?
That's a very good question. What we're going to see is additional consolidation, as much as this is possible given antitrust laws. The second thing we're going to see is plant closures. And what we're also going to see is a lot of restructuring, cost-cutting programs. Now, mind you, supplying Europe from China is not, for most products at least, is not a sustainable proposition to generate value for Chinese companies. I said that the chemical industry is multi-regional, and it is multi-regional because chemical products at large are relatively inexpensive. So a ton of a chemical product is somewhere between, I would say most of it is between $2,000 and $7,000 a ton. You need to add for trans-ocean deep sea freight and tariffs usually something between $100 and $150 per ton. Okay, that is somewhere between roughly 2 and 5% return on sales that you lose by shipping the material across the Atlantic. Now, such a loss easily can be afforded by folks that have stranded gas, like the countries in the Middle East, or let me say, regions that have other strong advantages that they can put into play. But let me say, for normal players, it's not very meaningful because the imports create a price umbrella under which the locals can compete. So the locals can have a cost position that is 2 to 5 percentage points worse than the importers, because that is what the importers need to put on top in terms of freight and tariff costs. And so eventually the situation is going to come back to a balance, which means that part of the European turnaround also will need to happen in China, because also for Chinese players, not going to be affordable forever to produce below cost, in particular below variable cost. So if everything would go by the book, we would expect consolidation in China, as it has happened, for instance, in the early 90s, in the big first downturn in the US or North America and Europe. Now, it's very unclear whether that consolidation in China is going to happen, given that the industry structure in China is different. It is, to a large degree, state-owned. And state-owned means, obviously, the national government, but it also means many provinces who own chemical companies. And that makes it very difficult, because consolidation always means that people lose. Someone in a consolidation loses because the company gets bought, or it gets joined or merged into a larger company, but not as a majority owner. And all these decisions to build these companies and to build the sites and to build the production facilities have been made by people with affiliation to the Communist Party, and they obviously don't want to lose face. And also, the local governments see those chemical companies as a means to keep employment up in an environment that, as we all know or have read in the press, currently does not offer a lot of jobs, in particular for young people. And I think this is going to make this consolidation process way more difficult than it has been in Europe or in North America in the beginning of the 90s. And as there's still capacities building that are being built up in China, as well as a shrinking demand growth. I'm not talking about shrinking demand, but I'm talking about shrinking demand growth. Unfortunately, we're probably going to look at a long and extended period of difficulties for the chemical industry globally, and also and particularly in Europe.
What trend do you think will affect chemical companies the most in today's market? Is it the consolidation you referenced? Is it
Yeah.
other?
It is the industry needs to resort itself. We're talking about Europe. We also could look at Southeast Asia, for instance. The situation is not very difficult and not very different. My apologies. The industry needs to resort itself, and that is going to have two components. We will need to see exits, plant closures, and obviously, as let me say, the plants in Europe tend to be much older than the plants in Asia. You're probably going to see a lot of plant closures in Europe, and by the way, also in North America. The plants are also not very recent, or at least most of them. And we're going to see industry consolidation in order to gain better cost positions. That's the only way, it's the only way forward. And obviously, we need to see a stop of new investments in the first place.
we could talk about macro for a considerable amount of time. If you don't mind me shifting the conversation over something that's a little bit closer to home, let's talk about tech for a second. I've heard you speak in the past about the evolution of, adoption of digital capabilities in the industry. And I've also heard you talk about the potential impact of AI for this industry. I think our audience would appreciate a couple minute summary of those thoughts.
Yeah, we all know that the chemical industry is a very digital industry when it comes to production. Certainly very advanced in using digital IT for all things production. But we also know that beyond that, the chemical industry has been very slow in adopting modern digital technologies in R&D, in marketing and sales, and in other business functions. We don't know, but many of us would share the belief that, however, in 10 to 15 years, maybe shorter, we will see an industry where a transaction will be executed by a vending machine on the sales side, talking to a buying machine on the procurement side, and the machine with access to the better data will win. Now, why has the adoption of modern digital technologies beyond production been so slow? It has been so slow because it was just not economic for the industry. It was not because the industry was too stupid or didn't get it or anything like that. The chemical industry is extremely fragmented in terms of products, in terms of production facilities, in terms of customer segments. It is extremely complex. That complexity is driven by the fact that the chemical industry really supplies everyone who produces something tangible. Everything that we can see around us in the room in which we are sitting has been produced with the support of the chemical industry. But because the chemical industry is the world of things, it creates a huge complexity. And in that complexity, the value, the business value of the individual use case for using modern digital approaches was just not attractive. Let's talk about production, which is a very good target for using artificial intelligence. When I still was a consultant, we were happy when we found a use case where the benefit was more than $10 million a year. Okay? Now, for a use case that has a benefit of $10 million a year, there's only so much money you can spend. And for a multi-billion-dollar company, $10 million is not so attractive. It becomes attractive if you're talking about $100, $200 million or 300, whatever. And then we're looking not only at 20 use cases, but we're probably looking at 50, 60, 70 use cases. And in order to establish so many use cases in a chemical company, you need a very significant investment in people, in skills, and in outsiders, consultants, etc., And if you do that, frankly, or if you did that in recent years, let's say 10 years ago, 5 years ago, it was an okay payback. It was an okay economic payback. Now, what's happening is that the payback is becoming better and better because implementing the use cases becomes cheaper and cheaper. And because technology is advancing and find solutions in the market, like the one of Node, that have not existed before, and that make the implementation of these use cases much cheaper. And so we are approaching a moment where using AI in a broader fashion, also in functions and, well, in production, but also in functions outside of production, becomes increasingly interesting and relevant. And given the enormous external pressures on the chemical industry that we just described a minute ago, and the need for the chemical industry to become more productive, to become more cost efficient, these two developments will come together, and eventually the chemical industry will become, let me say, just as digital as all the other industries as well. Maybe just a little later, but it will cross that point. We're gonna all experience the moment where an IE-based vending machine will talk to an IE-based procurement machine.
I don't think it's 10 to 15 years away.
You're probably right. I was a little conservative.
In the macro that we're in today, lots of leaders are thinking short term. If there isn't an immediate impact on revenue or productivity, and when I say immediate, it's within a calendar year, then it's hard to get the initiatives funded. What advice would you be giving CEOs that are trying to balance short-term expectations versus the requirement to continue to invest in the capabilities you just mentioned?
Naja, it is very clear that we all need to pay our rent. But for those executives who are interested in increasing shareholder value, it is very clear that that is mid to long-term exercise and not a short-term exercise. For one, so just for pure reasons of value creation, I think it's very, very meaningful to, yeah, you need to survive in the short term, but the difference is whether you're going to be successful in the mid and long term, and you need to be prepared for being successful in the long term. That's the first thought. When it comes to AI, the interesting thing is that the payback of modern digital technology comes actually very fast. Once you have set up the system, and Ali, you know, that can be a matter of weeks if you know what you're doing. But let's talk about months. Maybe it talks about months to establish AI for certain use cases in production. It takes months to establish an AI-based system for pricing management and sales and marketing. And the impact comes immediately. It goes very fast. It's not, in a way, what is the long-term part of a decision to go digital. It's not so much the time to impact. It is more the changes required in the company. You need to prepare a company for going to go digital. One of the most important things, for instance, is that a company knows what it knows, that it has access to its own data. Now, it usually has that in production, but it doesn't have that in R&D, it doesn't have that in marketing and sales, and it doesn't have that in many other business areas. And here, a certain, how shall I say, platform investment is required to make sure that a company actually knows what it knows. On the basis of that knowledge, the use cases can be established relatively fast.
I think historically there's been this perception, probably set by the implementation of ERPs, that it has to be very heavy and require many years of business process mapping and implementation and change management. And I think it's scarred the industry because there has been a disproportionate amount of failed implementations. And there's this constant perception that every tech project needs to be this way, rather than thinking about just what's the use case, start small, implement something, and get a win. Unfortunately, it's just not how this industry works. This industry works on like massive scale, but sometimes I forget that like you can start with a pilot and go from there. And with some of the advent of the latest technologies, I think that's what should be in play. If a CEO were to ask you, where should I start with digital transformation? What would your answer be?
I personally am a big believer in data. I would start with the data, essentially irrelevant of anything I would do after that, because without the data, in the end, nothing's gonna work. Once you have the data, I would suggest to establish a list of use cases. And I think there is quite some experience which use cases along the business system create the most value. There's clearly procurement, the eternal challenge of tail spending. There's tons of use cases that are very specific to the specific company, the specific production setup in production. There's plenty of use cases in supply chain, warehousing. There is clearly pricing. My number one when it comes to sales and marketing, but there's also the next products to buy. And there is the opportunity to do what I think Amazon and others do, to remind customers of replenish their warehouses when we understand that they run out of material. And those are my favorites, or would be my favorites in the moment.
Those are good ones. Those will impact the P&L, that's for sure. Florian, thank you for the insights. Folks love listening to these informal conversations with people like yourself that have helped shape the industry. Thank you for everything that you've done for the space and continue to do to help move this industry forward. It's always a pleasure to get your point of view on all of these topics. Good to see you, Florian.
The pleasure was all on my side. Thank you very much.